Hi, welcome for joining me. My name is Oscar with LordsofConsciousness.com and also with Beyond Your Matrix here with David. And your last name, I don't want to mispronounce it.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me on, Lords of Consciousness, and Oscar, great to meet you. My name's David Mathisen, and I just came out with my new book, Astrotheology for Life, but I'm here at Contact in the Desert with Lords of Consciousness. Thanks for asking me to come on the show.
Oh, well, thank you for agreeing to do a short little interview. We're really interested on a personal level. I loved Greek mythology growing up as a kid, and you know, I just love the stories behind it. And then you grow up, and then media out there starts making cartoons out of it, movies, Clash of the Titans and things of that nature. So how did this get introduced into your life? How old are you? Just give me a brief history of how you got involved in all this.
Great, yeah, it's great that you loved myths, because I loved myths growing up, Greek myths, also Norse myths, and I really can't remember a time when I didn't have these books that my parents got me about. I'm not even sure how to say the name, D'Aulaire's myths. It's Ingrid and Edgar Perrin d'Aulaire. They're pretty classic, large, oversized books about the Norse myths, the Greek myths, and also I grew up loving the stories in the Odyssey and Greek mythology, and so I've always loved the myths. And I actually had a chance to go back and teach mythology, the Odyssey, at the college level. Wow. Later on. But I've also grew up loving the stars, and so when actually, by reading some of Graham Hancock's work, and he talks about the book Hamlet's Mill, which was published in 1969. He talks about that in reference to the precession of the equinoxes, which is pretty important in a lot of the ancient mythology and also in the work that Graham and others are doing, the research. So I went and checked out Hamlet's Mill for myself, and they are talking about a connection between the myths and the stars. And not just the mythology, but also they talk about stories in the Bible, and it's worldwide. And they talk about how these stories, not just Greek myth, but myths from the Americas. They talk about specifically some myths from Guyana and myths from North America, the Native Americans, and even in China. And so once I learned that, I had to know more. So that's really how I got started on this track.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So is that basically what this book that you have here is about, kind of like the beginning stages of tying those clues together, or those theories?
Right. So this is my most recent book. So I've been the first book that I was really on this track is called The Undying Stars, and that talks about how the stories in the Bible and other myths, there's a tremendous amount of evidence. I would say it's indisputable, there's so much evidence, but let me just say there's a lot of evidence that these stories are talking about. They're using this celestial system. And the thing about Hamlet's Mill is they understand that this language, I call it the language of the stars. The myths are speaking the language of the stars. So they understand that language is going on, but they don't really give you that much of the vocabulary. They'll say, oh, this story of Samson, when he grabs the jawbone, that is the Hyades, because they're shaped like a V. And that's like a direct dictionary definition of this myth, this star. But they don't always do that. A lot of times they kind of say, this appears to be based on the stars, or this is based on the stars, and the reader will know what I mean. And you go, wait a minute, tell me, what do you mean? Right. So some people have said Hamlet's Mill is kind of a frustrating book, but I kind of set out to understand kind of the grammar and the vocabulary of the myths so that people could understand them for themselves. So I started writing with The Undying Stars, how this appears to be taking place all over the world, and then I started writing a series called Star Myths of the World and how to interpret them, and going deep into Volume 2 is all about the Greek myths. Volume 3 is called Star Myths of the Bible, so showing how these stories in the Bible are using the same system as the stories in Greek myth. We could talk about, maybe in a podcast, a longer format, direct parallels between, for instance, there's a foot washing scene in the Odyssey where he's in disguise and his nurse is washing his feet, and there's a foot washing scene in the Bible in the New Testament. So in those books, I'm trying to explain the vocabulary so that people can learn it for themselves. And then those are pretty thick books with like The Bible one has 766 pages. So I, with my newest one, I wanted it to be thinner, a little less intimidating maybe, but also it's called Astrotheology for Life, because I'm trying to show, sometimes people say, well, what does it all mean? And I do talk about that in those books, but how does it apply to my life? So just to wrap up, I'm not trying to tell you how to interpret the myths. I'm trying to tell you it's pretty clear they're speaking a celestial language, and if you learn that language, or if you start to learn that language, then you can go to the myths for yourself and start to ask them what they mean. Don't ask me.
Right.
Ask the myth what it means. And so I suggest what it may mean and how it may apply to your life. But once you learn the system, you may say, well, thanks for showing me the language, but now that I can talk to the myths for myself, I realize Dave had it a little wrong here. This is what it means. Or, you don't have to have an interpreter, in other words.
Right.
Once you know it yourself, then you don't need the interpreter to tell you what that person is saying.
I kind of call it like really serious. It is seeking your own truth to all these things, to be able to, your mind and as an individual, because we are also, even though we're one consciousness, we have our individual minds, right? So we have to be able to find a way to connect to these stories in order to truly understand them. And I have a two-part question in this, because it really arises of the foot washing that you're talking about. These two different stories come from two different times and locations, as some parts, and all over the world there's similar stories. So do you think it really is all, like, for example, that whole scene was about being able to give love and taking care of someone, in my interpretation at least, from when I grew up listening and learning the Bible, and do you think that was just stories showing us that we need to take care of each other, that the bigger overall galactic cosmic one consciousness, one love type of storyline that they want us to learn?
That's a great question. So first you said, we're all seeking our own truth, and I love how your show is called Lords of Consciousness, right? Because actually these stories, there's a famous quote I like to use from Alvin Boyd Kuhn, where he says these stories are not about old ancient kings and ancient queens. They're about each and every human being. And you're not going to understand the Bible. He actually says no one will understand the Bible completely until you realize that it's about you. It's about you. And because King Solomon had this ancient wisdom, or this tremendous wisdom. No one else had King Solomon's wisdom. But if you think of it as, well, King Solomon is this ancient historical person who got this great wisdom, that's great for him, but how does that impact me? I mean, I wish I had that wisdom, but I don't. Actually, these stories are about you actually have access to the same source that King Solomon has access to. So now to your specific question about, look, the Odyssey, we're pretty sure the Odyssey was written, some people say 800 BC, some people say older than 800 BC. It's definitely older than 500 BC, because we know writers from 500 BC who are referring to it. So Odyssey is pretty old, and New Testament, you would think, is newer than 800 BC. Now, I actually think the New Testament is extremely ancient. In fact, I think all these, it may be a newer version of some very ancient mythological patterns, but the stories in the New Testament, like I said, relate to the Odyssey. They also clearly relate to the Osiris, Isis in ancient Egypt. But it's probable, I believe, that there was some ancient culture that even predates ancient Egypt, even predates ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Indus, Saraswati civilization. The most ancient civilizations that we know are already using this, appear to be using this system. It's definitely in the Gilgamesh stories. It's definitely in the pyramid texts. So it's probably a very ancient source. So now to your second part of your two-part question. I'll try and keep your your video timely, but I definitely believe that is a valid interpretation. Caring for one another, blessing. The scriptures in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, are very heavily talking about blessing versus cursing. There's stories in the Old Testament where Balaam is called upon to curse the enemies of this certain king, and then he goes there and an angel is standing in his way and says, don't curse them, you can't curse them. blessing and cursing, and it's all through the New Testament, of course. Blessing. James says, hey, out of our same mouth comes blessing and cursing. That should not be. Things like this. So elevating others is definitely part of this. Elevating, I mean, we could get into kind of a long discussion of it, but the specific foot washing scene, and I talk about it in Star Myths of the World Volume 2, which is all about the Greek myths, and I talk about it in Star Myths World Volume 3, which is Star Myths of the Bible, I believe is pretty clearly connected with the Orion constellation. And next to Orion, actually coming out of his toe, the toe of Orion is Rigel, and the river Eridanus actually flows out of his toe. Eridanus actually sounds, linguistically, it is related to Jordan. Eridanus, the Jordan River. It's in the heavens as well. So there's a heavenly river. There's lots of heavenly rivers, like the Ganga, the Ganges River flows out of the locks of Shiva. It's a heavenly river, and then it flows down through the stars to Earth. So we're matching up stars and Earth. But anyway, the river Eridanus flows out of the toe of Orion. So in some myths, like, I don't know if you know Hephaestus or Hephaestus. He's the Vulcan, the forge, the god of fire. And he's cast down to earth by either Hera or Zeus. And so his feet get twisted and he has to be carried around on this robot that he builds. Sometimes he's traveling around, is carried by a donkey, which relates back to the story of Balaam that we could go on and on. But there's specific constellations that they refer to. But sometimes he builds this metal robot named Talos, this metal robot, and the robot is actually, he's finally dismantled or slain when they unscrew a little screw in the back of his heel and all his hydraulics flow out. Well, stuff flowing out of the foot of a robot, that's, I believe, Orion with the river Eridanus. So you have this kind of thing happening. So that's same, when Eurycleia, the nurse of Odysseus, realizes it's Odysseus, when she's doing the foot washing, she drops the thing she drops her basin and the water flows out. So I believe that the clues are very clear that we're talking about that part of the sky. So to understand what these specific myths mean, once you start to know, it's like a code. There's different parts of the sky that refer to different aspects of the human condition and what we're supposed to be doing. For instance, Sagittarius and Scorpio are positioned right around the widest, brightest part of the Milky Way that has a galactic rift, and in some cultures that's a birth canal, like the Maya, the galactic rift. They call it the birth canal. So that part of the sky is actually very often a birth, but it's often a spiritual birth. It's not the first birth. In a lot of stories there's twins, or there's two births, or there's two mothers, and it's actually talking about us. And so if you know, well, what does this part of the sky usually refer to? And also, between Sagittarius and Scorpio is the winter solstice, at least in the age of Aries. But even in the age of prior, it was Scorpio. So the winter solstice is a turning. It's when everything's going down, 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 the sun is going down, and then eventually it turns back up. So that's blessing and cursing. Like, cursing is putting people down. Blessing is lifting people up. Now Orion, he's in a different part of the sky, and he actually relates to precession. A lot of times precession, because the age of Taurus ended, and Taurus and Orion are right next to each other, and there's lots of authors who talk about this, but like Osiris being cut up by his brother Set and chopped into pieces and thrown into the river relates to Orion being held down below the horizon. So precession a lot of times has to do with disconnection, being disconnected. And Odysseus, of course, is disconnected. When we find him at the beginning of the Odyssey, he's away from home. He's on this island. He's been living with his goddess for 8 years, actually, having sex with her every night, because and the text says he didn't really want to, but he has to have sex with his beautiful goddess. But he misses home. He's dislocated. He's not where he's supposed to be. It's actually our condition. We're down here in this human body. We're from the realm of spirit, but we're going through this watery realm. We're 7/8 of water. So Odysseus has to get tossed into the ocean and get back home. So the gods, so Athena says, hey, this isn't right. We got to fix this situation. So she goes to Zeus, and then she comes down and says, or actually Hermes goes. Zeus says, okay, send Hermes. Hermes goes and says, hey, Odysseus, wake up, man. You're not supposed to be hanging out with this goddess forever. You've got a home. Get on to it. So he makes a raft and he goes.
Yeah.
So it's about disconnection and reconnecting. And so blessing and
Awakening.
cursing. Yeah, and getting back to where we're supposed to be and elevating. So
Yeah.
long answer, but you gave me a two-part question.
No, definitely. And if you don't mind, I do one more. And if I'd like to show the chart real quick, because my question is based off of like.
Yeah. I
So-
didn't pull it up because
No, yeah.
Orion's not on this.
No,
one.
no,
This-
but-
this is Sagittarius and Scorpio. This is Sagittarius and Scorpio. So I didn't pull it out for Orion, but
Well, my question is, and arises, what came first, the stories or the you know, like the were the stars? Do you think the stars were created and aligned? The universe aligned them perfectly for these stories, or did these stories, these all these galaxies, did people visit us from these, and then the story started developing from these mythical stories, from these visitations spiritually, or whatever you want to call it, you know, if it was an ET, you know, someone manifesting to someone and giving them the information. What do you think might have happened first?
this is a fantastic interviewer right here. So that's a great question. So first I'll give you the cop-out answer, but it's the true answer is I don't know. Okay, so I've found all this evidence, and I'm not the first one to talk about this, of course. I became obsessed with it and really started to try and understand the vocabulary and the grammar of it. But this system is definitely, I believe, is definitely there, and it is so sophisticated. It is so deep, and like you said, it's almost like the stars were put there perfectly. So I don't know where it came from. I do have a lot of evidence that it's extremely ancient, because in this book, in Astrotheology for Life, I even show, and Graham Hancock shows it as well in Magicians of the Gods, how even Göbekli Tepe, they seem to be using this. So it's clearly an extremely sophisticated, whoever gave this to us. Now, I don't believe that necessarily has to be aliens.
Right.
In fact, I believe, enlightened humans,
Right.
or extremely spiritually sophisticated humans. So I believe there was an extremely spiritually sophisticated and probably technologically sophisticated, because these ancient monuments, the technology is different from ours, but they are sophisticated, and their ratios are amazing, and they're models of the earth, and they're on these great circle alignments. Okay, so I believe there was an ancient culture of extreme. They were brilliant. If this is the way they mapped out the stars, but the stars were already there, or some people could say, wait a minute, the creator, the universe put them there that way because you humans are going to need this. I don't know.
Maybe other civilizations that have already gone through what we're going through are there now, their due diligence to come and teach us and guide us and bring these stories to us, or something like that.
I definitely don't deny that possibility. I don't really get into that too much in my.
Okay.
I'm trying to show how it applies spiritual. I believe it's a spiritual metaphor, but I definitely believe that whoever gave this is like a precious inheritance to humanity. Whoever gave it to us, this is like an ancient treasure, and so we don't want it to be lost, and we don't want to ignore what they're telling us. And it could be intelligences from somewhere else, but I believe it really applies to us, whether you believe in that or not. It is for you to raise your spiritual consciousness. It's like we need it, and you may not even need to understand that it relates to the stars. I think you can get tremendous truth out of this. For thousands of years, people evidently knew it because it was connected. There's pottery and things that relate to the outlines of the constellations, which we could get into at another time. But you don't even need to know. You can read the Bible and not know that it's connected to the stars, and know that there's beauty and truth there that helps your life. But you can find the same thing in the Odyssey. The tragedy is that some people say, oh, we have to shut down these myths because they are pagan and we are right and they are wrong.
Or to fiction.
Right, and this is more true as myth. It's not literal. I believe it's myth, but it's true. I'm not saying it's not true. And so the Odyssey can be your Bible. The Bhagavad Gita, it is all based on the same system, and it's, I think, all telling us this.
A root to all stories. There's always a root to every story, no matter how mythical it is. There's a truth to everything, and I appreciate your time taking it with us, and hopefully we can get a longer interview in the future that we can sit down and go into more details in this rabbit hole. So I appreciate your time,
Yeah,
David.
thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us here at lordsofconsciousness.com. Peace.